Ever wonder how a breakthrough idea actually becomes reality? Hi, I'm Susan Lindner, and this is the Innovation Storytellers Show, where I sit down with the change makers behind the world's most inspiring innovations to learn how they did it and the stories that help them make it happen. If you've ever had a big idea or want to tell yours in a more powerfully connected way, you're in the right place. I promise you'll get new ideas for how to tell a better story to your audiences too. So let's dive in. Welcome back. I'm Susan Lindner, your host of Innovation Storytellers. And today is a question for all of my listeners. Are you ready to take a very big bet on leadership? Are you ready to really dig in and think about the ways that you're going to be not just an innovator, but an innovative leader in your space? And it's one of the reasons I wanted to invite John Rossman on my show today, because he has been just that for years and is now taking his learning and wisdom to companies around the world. So let me introduce you first. My guest, John Rossman, is a former Amazon executive who launched the Amazon Marketplace and is a 4-time best-selling author, including The Amazon Way and Big Bet Leadership. John's expertise in digital transformation, leadership, and innovation has made him a trusted advisor to Fortune 500 companies and startups alike. His latest free ebook, Rossman's Business Manifesto for Competitive Advantage, The Pig, the Lipstick, and the Playbook of Champions, is a bold guide to achieving transformational success. Welcome to the show, John.
Susan, thanks for having me.
Okay, so this is going to be a really fun conversation because I think sometimes my listening audience is so heads down on coming up with the next innovation or trying to get that innovation through all of the stage gates necessary to hit the finish line that we don't necessarily stop and take a breath and talk about leadership. So let's start off with your journey first. How did you enter the innovation house? How did you get there?
It was a plan from the start. No, I'm just kidding.
Said no one ever.
I'm an industrial engineer by background, right? So I've always been interested in like efficiency and integration and ergonomics, which kind of naturally leads you into like, how do you improve a situation or innovate, typically with a technology essence to that change. And so really my career has just been a set of different contexts in which I've gotten to leverage that lens of like, how do we improve a situation using every tool that we can, from process design to metrics to communication to technology to policies to strategy. And that's really how I view myself, which is an integrated problem solver to help improve a hard situation.
So what's an example of that?
Well, I mean, 35 years worth of career, but as we were talking about, the spark that Big Bet Leadership was written off of was I got to be the senior innovation advisor to T-Mobile for 3 years. My client, Kevin McCaffrey, ran new business incubation. And so our charter was to conceptualize and test out new concepts kind of beyond the core of T-Mobile's existing business. And so we rewired a lot of the Amazon working backwards techniques, plus some other things, to create not just a process, but like a way to work through these situations that was very different from how T-Mobile did it today. You may not know this, but T-Mobile's in Bellevue, Washington, kitty corner to Amazon, distinctly did not want to be Amazon, but many of the first principles of how Amazon leverages kind of this memo writing technique really helps you think these things through, plus some other things. So the essence of Big Bet Leadership is kind of that rewired playbook and other things Kevin and I learned along the way, plus other things I learned along the way of the past 25 years, for a guide for senior leaders and the teams that support senior leaders on how to do your job when you're actually proposing a major transformation, a major change, right? So that could be an innovation program, a digital transformation, an AI strategy, a growth strategy. A merger acquisition can be a big bet, but at the end of the day, a big bet is any concept that has high ambition, but loads of issues, complications, dependencies, and assumptions to it.
And tons of risk.
Those are all elements of risk. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. So tell us a little bit about your time at T-Mobile. Tell us a little bit about that experience and some of the stories around your innovation experiences there.
Yeah, it was a fantastic core team that was very deliberate in both doing the job that we needed to do, which was to set up a pipeline of vetting ideas kind of through different stages, as well as being willing to rethink like the way we worked together. And the major change that we made relative to that was how to start with the end in mind, start with a big ambition, work backwards to what are all the things that must be true in order to deliver that major future state, and then figure out an experimentation path to test out those high aspect things. It was fantastic work. It was done in the context of two major challenges, one of which was an acquisition that T-Mobile was going through, which was a major issue. It took a year and a half for that acquisition to be reviewed and approved. And it also happened kind of during the pandemic. And so between those two minor things, we conducted this work, and it really was the playbook that they were positioning if the acquisition wasn't approved. The acquisition was approved, but they still went forward with some of the concepts that came out of that, in particular, the home broadband business and a couple of other businesses kind of came through some of that early learnings from the new business incubation team.
And what was the consequence in the event that things didn't go right, that you were working on between COVID, right, which was like, and and the acquisition? What were some of the consequences that might have existed?
Well, the consequences were we couldn't get all of the attention that I think, normally would have gotten if the acquisition wasn't going on in parallel. But again, like this was a hedge that they put in place. They were working backwards from like, if we want our stock to be at X, we need to be growing EBITDA at Y. What are the ways we are going to engineer up to this market cap that they were targeting? And so that was kind of the work back at a macro level that they were doing. And as the acquisition took more and more and more senior leadership time, it was difficult to always get all the cycles, but that made it all that much important that we could be precise about the problem that we were proposing to solve for customers, what the market was that we saw, what we thought the reality is for T-Mobile. And most importantly, I think that one of the real innovations that I saw Kevin and that team drive was this notion that the financial plan, the business case, which oftentimes gets done early in a concept, gets done by a finance team that's disconnected, quickly gets positioned as like, well, here's a set of facts that we are working against versus a set of assumptions and guesses, and does not get connected to the actual testing that needs to happen in an innovation. And oftentimes it's that cost model that is the biggest aspect of what must go right for an innovation to work. But yet most of our attention, most of our testing gets focused on kind of product positioning, product features. Does the product work instead of, is our cost model valid? So I think one of the real emphasis points that we put in Big Bet leadership was around cost model innovation and testing the assumptions from a future back targeted P&L into your testing log.
Testing those assumptions along the way is so critical. And sometimes, when you're in the crunch that you're in, you don't necessarily have that time, right? Because you're going 100 miles an hour in the midst of a merger, right? And trying to make all that happen. the pressure is so significant, I'd imagine, that it really tests all the other systems, especially the communication side of the coin.
Well, that's true. And I think one of the, you know, lessons, and this is from Amazon and a lot of other places, that if you want to win at major transformation, is that the most controllable factor you have is allocating leadership attention to the initiative. And so we were fortunate in that we did have kind of more or less a full-time team focused on this new business incubation capability. And so our attention wasn't so we were very focused, and our attention wasn't so much distracted. It was the ability to broadcast it to the broader executive team that was impacted by that. But again, like the lessons of getting at the heart of the matter as quickly and efficiently as possible. And what we've, proven again is that memo writing is the best way to communicate dense, meaning like this is not simple topics we are talking about, in a clear way so that executives can do their job, which is to actually contemplate, is this a smart endeavor for us to undertake? These things are called big bets because it's the ambition that is big, but they are a bet because we are recognizing the inherent calculated risk that goes on as part of the nature of this. And so creating that input that senior executives need to be able to contemplate resource allocation and which things to do and which things not to do, which are the most important decisions that the senior executive team makes. Like that was our job to do. And, the book of Big Bet Leadership is in large part how to do that job of communicating and managing share stakeholders kind of throughout the process from, idea conceptualization to kill, pivot, continue, or confusion decisions.
So let's talk about the communications of it, because other guests from Amazon have been on the show and hit on it briefly, but you dedicate a whole chapter, and not to mention additional resources, right, that even my listeners can take advantage of how do you do it? Like,
yeah, yeah.
First through the intellectual framework of, because there are lots of people who think we can just innovate without communicating about it and still getting the right results. and I hope this podcast has put that notion to bed once and for all. I hope really we put the nail in the coffin on that one. But what's the framework that we need to start thinking about first and foremost when we're doing innovation communications?
Well, I'd say like everything is about communication, right? And so unless you live in a disconnected, isolated world, like it's always about communication. So even if it's just the core team, it's a communication challenge, right? And beyond that, it just ripples in effect. But if you were to ask, what is Amazon's innovation process? Most people would say it's called working backwards, right? And so it's this notion of 6-page narratives, future press releases, FAQs that are written and debated about to get the best thinking about how to solve this important customer problem and do it in a unique way that ends up with a great business, right? Like that's the job to be done relative to that. And most Amazon books, including mine, The Amazon Way and Think Like Amazon, kind of leave it as like, write a 6-page narrative. Here's what a future press release looks like. Here's some example FAQs. What we did at T-Mobile and what Big Bet Leadership captures is like, okay, let's break that up into a set of specific memos that help a team actually do that really well for a team that isn't used to this style or the discipline of writing for clarity. Clarity means both simplicity of thinking plus completeness of thinking. It's a really hard essence to get. Most teams they first skimp on the completeness of thinking, then they skip on the simplicity of communicating that across. It's difficult to get both the completeness and the simplicity, which is what clarity of thinking is about. And so we broke it up into 4 essential memos. The first one is called the what sucks memo. The what sucks memo is the essence of like, what is the pain that your customer is solving and why is it important to them? It ends with a hypothesis, a killer feature. Take that killer feature into the next memo, which is called the outcome definition memo, or as I oftentimes refer to it as the WTF memo, the what's the future memo. And the outcome definition memo takes that killer feature and outlines, well, what are the things that must be true in order to deliver this killer feature? That starts identifying the risks, the hypotheses, the assumptions that you are making of things that must be true in order to deliver this compelling future state. Third memo is an outcome financial memo, also called the juice memo. Is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Which is this business case that we already talked about, a future-backed P&L cost model that says what are the critical things about the cost model and the P&L that must be true to deliver a great business at the end of the day. In my experience, innovation teams do this once up front and forget about essentially the business case and the business case drivers until the end when they are launching. And I think that's a deficiency. The fourth memo is the classic Amazon future press release. You can't start with the future press release in a complex situation. You have to earn your way up to it. And the future press release is a communication for a broader set of stakeholders that talks about the emotional customer problem that we're solving and why it's important, and then addresses the hard things that we have to do in order to solve this. So it's prepping the organization for the change and the hard decisions that we might have to do in order to get here. And in a big bet, it's going to talk about the risks and the hypotheses that we have to test, and that this is a journey. We aren't confident in this yet. That's the journey that we're going to go through. And so those memos give the core team and the people who have to contemplate this like the essential insights to make really good resource allocation decisions. But it does more than that. This creates what we refer to as the big bet vector, right? A vector has 2 points, the problem statement and the hypothesis of the future state. We use that big bet vector across the course of exploring this concept. One of the key values is creating a communications plan, right? And the essence of what in my experience, leaders who do communicate, they tend to do so on kind of a burning platform metaphor, which is like, we have to change, we have to innovate, we have to solve this problem. That's helpful to a point, but it actually doesn't tell me the precision of, well, what problem are we solving? So we're all open to interpreting different versions of this problem that we are solving. And most importantly, it doesn't tell me, well, what do I think the future state is, right? So we're all left to make meaning about what we think that ambitious future state would be. So we give the leader the framework of becoming a chief repeating officer, which tells stories to repeat. Here's the problem with clarity that we are solving. Here's our hypothesis for the future state and why we think it's worthwhile. And here's the journey that we're going on. So that depending upon the stakeholder group, they can make meaning in the appropriate way that they need to make meaning. That is strategic communication. And if I think of all of Jeff Bezos' superpowers that he has, it's the one that doesn't get referenced very often is his strategic communication capability, right? So, just a few examples relative to that. 1997 shareholder letter gets attached to every Amazon shareholder letter, and it specifically tells people who are investing in Amazon what we believe in, what we don't believe in, and please don't invest in Amazon if you don't believe in those things. The right. Amazon leadership principles, right? So I wrote the book on the Amazon leadership principles, the Amazon way. That is Jeff's codification of like, this is how I believe we should work together, how we should make decisions, what we should prioritize, how we hold each other accountable, the playbook. His whole day one framing, right, which is a repeatable hook that he has unpacked multiple times about being a company that is not looking to optimize just for today, but one that's looking to invent for tomorrow and be optimistic about tomorrow. So those are just a few examples of kind of the strategic communication that are necessary to be a big bet legend.
Yeah. You know, and some of the pieces that you've called out here are certainly ones I use in my storytelling work. I think there's also a place for a couple of things like what is the consequence of not doing this, right? Of really making it apparent to not just the competitive threats that might be surrounding us, right? Or a young whippersnapper disruptor who wants to come in and, pull the picnic blanket out from underneath us, but also reputationally, sometimes it's an employee issue, right? That we need to acknowledge that things need to change for with lots of different levers involved, not just necessarily market forces, which are certainly the biggest driver, but sometimes there are even process drivers internally that allow us to make choices and innovate in ways that it's our communication directly to the employees that is front line before we get to the customer.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I don't know if we nailed that in big bet leadership, if I'm being completely transparent. I am preparing with a client. We're going to do a pre-mortem exercise for a big bet that they have going on. You're familiar with a pre-mortem?
I have not heard that term before. So
Oh, so you know what
yeah,
you know what a
sure know
postmortem
what a
is, right?
postmortem has been
So
through a couple painful.
a
Yeah.
pre-mortem is one that you do you're forecasting a disaster, right? And so you write out like it's a year from now or 18 months or whatever, and this initiative is a failure. Tell the story, the vivid story of the failure and what went wrong. But you do this beforehand, right? So it's a pre-mortem, not a post-mortem. And what it does is it helps people kind of do what you're getting at, which is the consequences of either success or not taking an action or not treating things appropriately. So yeah, the pre-mortem is one way I've done of kind of doing that consequences thinking and storytelling.
Yeah. And we have to be really careful what the timing is on that pre-mortem too, because we don't want to invite all the critics in
Oh
necessarily.
yeah, for sure.
Right. And we also want to make sure we don't dim the enthusiasm around a project that seems to have so much hope. We're like, no, let's do the pre-mortem on D-Day before, because if we did that, right.
And in this particular case, this workshop that I'm preparing for, like, we'll be doing goal setting, we'll be doing a lightweight future press release, but kind of they've got some internal kind of how we work stuff to work out.
Mm.
And I think this is an appropriate and friendly way of helping them get to kind of that truth seeking of like, the enemy is within here, right? Like it's not the market. It's like we've got all the resources, all the customers, all the capabilities. The reason this might fail is because of how we work. And so kind of getting them to peel off the friendly veneer and kind of get to the essence of like, okay, we got to tackle some things about how we work together and make hard choices.
Yeah. It's probably my proclivity as an anthropologist, but each company that I go to work in, I view as its own country. And I think, okay, here's a culture that I'm going to be invading, for lack of a better term, that I'm going to be visiting with my pith helmet and my magnifying glass and coming into that place and thinking, okay, I know that each company has its own political structure, has its own economic structure, has its own social structure. It has its norms, it has its values and religion.
And it has its histories that shape it, scar it, and everything. Yes.
Right. And part of that future casting is a slide in that I like to use called Imagine If, because I've come to find in writing these innovation stories with clients that if I'm the only projector of the future, if me and my innovation team are the only ones talking about what the future looks like, and I don't invite the listener in to help sculpt and shape that future together, then the opportunity to negate that potential future is high. And so the way I de-risk the story is also by using words like imagine if and what if. And I invite the audience to come in and give me their ideas about the future and see how we can sculpt that together.
Yeah. Brilliant.
If I leave people out of the future direction and just come with it pronounced, then there's an opportunity where people say, I don't want that future, or that's not what incentivizes me. That's a very interesting future for this group, but not for that group. So how do I get us all, to knock down the silos so we can march forward together into the future?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I agree.
So
Like, I think that concept of looking at every company as a country, like, with a history that needs to be decoded is really helpful.
yeah, most of the work that I start off doing is getting people to talk about their shared history. Like, tell me a little bit about where we've innovated before, where it's worked and where it hasn't worked, largely because the group bonds over the past, like, tragedies rather than the triumphs.
Yeah.
And when we start sharing some of the battle scars together, we also allow a little bit more vulnerability into the room, that we can share those experiences and be like, yeah, that really sucked. Remember when we tried to launch that and it totally died? Yeah. Oh, yeah. And we go, yeah, but we got over it and we went through, and then we're preparing for that next part. So you've done some extraordinary work with the Gates Foundation, John, and I'm wondering if you'll share some of those experiences and the stories that were necessary in order to move those projects along.
Yeah, so I was a partner at a firm called Alvarez and Marcel for 12 years after Amazon. And my key client was the Gates Foundation, did over 80 different engagements with them over 8 years. And most of our work was in the field. So the foundation had a strategy and a fund. They're a strategist and funder by definition. They are not a delivery organization. And so they would equip us to bring together a set of stakeholders when something actually had to work at the end of the day. It wasn't just an advocacy or positioning situation. And so all of our work was around, like, how do we create a shared definition of, like, what it is that we need to do, what problem are we solving, what's the future state going to look like, what are all the dependencies that have to happen, and help get that executed and delivered. One of the key opportunities was a program that came out of the Race to the Top initiative that came out of the TARP situation in 2009, right? So the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, allocated a ton of money to help raise the bar relative to U.S. education. The Gates Foundation wanted to bring together a cloud-based system that would help bring and scale individualized learning into classroom situations. So you can think about, like, oh, what does that require, right? Well, it requires actually understanding the student, where they're at, what kind of learning methods they have, and map it to the context of, like, what you need to teach them, right? So a rubric of education. And that platform got spun out, called In Bloom, and In Bloom failed. And In Bloom failed not because of a technology failure. It didn't fail because of a funding failure. It failed because of a lack of forecasting the strategic communication, the resistance that was going to come, despite all the goodness that you could talk about, the problem that was solving, easily twisted into a set of stories about, school districts losing control, teachers losing control, and that. And so it really was, and this wasn't my evaluation, this was an actual postmortem that the foundation had done relative to this. It was a lack of putting enough firepower to the strategic communication and getting ahead, forecasting what those communication points were going to be coming from the opposition, if you would, and getting ahead of those points. And so it was yet another way for me to learn the bitter truth, which is communication matters. And you have to, that's why we framed it in Big Bet Leadership as the chief repeating officer. Repeat. Now you need to repeat something that actually is helpful. It can't be empty calorie communication. But that notion that communication is one of the major planks that typically gets underserved through this innovation and transformation capability, it was a way for me to see that in action. So we talk about that story in big bet leadership, and I see that as one of the the big disappointments in a lot of the work that I've gotten to do, because it was a great solution, obviously a fantastic problem to help solve out there. It was a
Sure.
great opportunity, and the foundation and a bunch of stakeholders failed because of, I think, the lack of getting ahead on strategic communication.
It's amazing, right? I know I started my business because I thought to myself, I will not let any great idea die because it lacks a story to propel it forward. And it's the biggest heartbreak of mine to see great ideas die because people couldn't effectively communicate their value to the folks who needed it most.
Here's another point of failure that I've seen way too often, which is what I refer to as high stakes decisions and high stake meetings, right? And so these are the meetings where we come together, and it's like, we're someplace along the journey on a specific concept or portfolio of concepts, right? And we need to make, decisions like, do we kill it? Do we continue? Do we pivot? But what typically happens in those meetings, which is confusion, right? We're not super clear about what the criteria is for how to make this decision. We're not super clear on who gets to make this type of decision. We're not super clear how to run this meeting. We're not super clear about the outputs of this meeting. So we have a chapter in the book, chapter 6, called Continue, Kill, Pivot, or Confusion. And what it does is it frames out the challenge of these high stakes meetings and provides a framework for how you need to actually run these meetings for the purpose that they need to run, which is make the best clear-eyed decision about what do we do going forward on a particular situation. Some of the things that tend to happen is these become meetings of kind of audit, right? Like, well, why are we at where we're at? How did we get here? Which is important, but not in this meeting, right? Like, that is a separate discussion, a separate analysis that needs to be done, which is like, well, what are the learnings on how we got out of this? The job of this meeting is to make the best future, next best available step relative to a situation. You need to recognize these as a high stakes meeting. You need to plan them and prep the stakeholders accordingly. You need to facilitate this meeting well, and you need to communicate coming out of it. This is the decision that was made, and to whatever appropriate degree, here is why that decision was made. Here's what lent us to it, right? So to me, it's another aspect of storytelling, which is to tell the next step story about, like, here are decisions that are made. And so that we don't end up with the classic situations of, well, we weren't clear about whether we were actually killing this initiative or not, so we let it continue on as kind of a ghost project, bleeding us of resources that are needed, or we're not clear about, well, what do we think the criteria is to actually scale this or to go to the next level relative to this. Those are the types of classic poor setup in these high stakes meetings.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because if we know anything about innovation, the majority of the bets we make or the inquiries we make along the way fail if we're doing it right. That's why 8 out of 10 venture investments fail, right? It's why I was at Gothenburg in Sweden a couple of weeks ago with Volvo and looking at their innovation board and having 150 pilots going, right? You can see that their idea testing infrastructure is massive, but you come around the corner to this whiteboard and you get into the failure corner, like all those ideas that they are not pursuing. And there's a giant list of things we're not pursuing. And for the innovation team, that is a fantastic outcome. You're like, great, I have so much more clarity because I know these things are not going in that direction. And by the way, here's all the learnings and the ROI out of those learnings from those failures. But for a CFO walking by, right, that is a challenging board to take a look at. But the clarity that these folks have to say, we killed this is why, this is because, and we're moving on with these 5 bets. Because
yeah, there's a quote that is, most companies don't die of starvation, they die of indigestion, right? And what that quote is about
wow.
is that is it's not lack of good ideas. It's the lack of not picking the right limited number of ideas to actually resource in a way to win. The book Essentialism is one of the, I kind of tend to mention four books that kind of lead to how I think about strategy, communication, and priority setting. And those three books are Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, Essentialism, and Change, How to Change When Change is Hard, right? But essentially, essentialism is the story of how to keep the main thing the main thing. And in most enterprises, the reason they can't pull off a major transformation is because they are trying to do too many things all at once. And one of the funny stories Kevin McCaffrey would say is, he went into a T-Mobile executive meeting, and they had 10 corporate priorities, and his job was to get them down to 5, and they came out of the meeting with 15. But that is the reality of what's going on, right? And so having really good criteria for how to kill, pivot, continue is the critical nature of these high stakes meetings. And that is a big essence of why we wrote Big Bet Leadership, because those are high stakes decisions. And my newsletter is called the Digital Leader Newsletter, a Big Bet Briefing. And it is all about how to make these high stakes decisions. Because at the end of the day, that's what so much of this transformation and innovation process is about, is there are points where there are some very high stakes decisions to be made, and there is a discipline in order to make those correctly, consistently, and to communicate them appropriately.
Right. And that would probably put a lot of my listeners in their jobs a whole lot longer in the event that they could do those, right? To really hold their own in those high stakes meetings, because it's so critical. Because innovation is one of those things that feels like an ethereal kind of thing, where a lot of people in the audience think, oh, someone's coming up with the next iPhone for our business, right? So that's what innovation translates to, when it's really not. There's so many more individual decisions that get made along the way.
Yep.
John, I'm going to shift to our hot seat questions that I ask everybody who comes on the show. So in your estimation, what is the greatest innovation of all time?
The wheel.
The wheel.
Imagine where we'd be without the wheel.
Yeah, absolutely central to the evolution of our planet, for sure. If you had the opportunity to join any innovation team in human history, which team would you have joined?
Well, it was the marketplace team at Amazon that I got to help lead. So I got to be that part of that team.
Yeah. Any other that makes you envious?
So I would have liked to have been part of the Xerox PARC innovation team, the team that invented the Ethernet, invented the mouse, invented WYSIWYG, invented so many things, and didn't take advantage of them, because that's what I would have helped them avoid, is not taking advantage of the future that they invented.
Right. Maybe don't give the mouse to Steve Jobs. Maybe not.
Right.
And I haven't heard WYSIWYG in 100 years. So thank you.
Exactly.
For that. And what is the innovation that the world needs now?
The innovation the world needs now. So I wrote about it in Big Bet Leadership, which is, I don't know if this is the biggest innovation the world needs now, but all of these cloud providers have their clients just locked in. And I think that there is an opportunity to create a real-time allocation service that allows freedom of choice on a real-time basis for the IT organizations that are allocating kind of their spend and their compute to these cloud resource providers.
So that's the innovation. We need the ability to walk out of your cloud and into a new one, or into something else entirely.
On a workload by workload, transaction by transaction basis, right? And think about the competition that would open up to innovate in cloud services, right? Speed, quality, cost, those things would improve dramatically.
The statistic really stuck out to me when I learned that the average consumer stays with their bank 17 years.
Wow.
So there's a wealth of competition available to every banking customer on the planet. And some of my banking listeners are going to be like, zip it, Lindner. But we tend to stay with those institutions where we opened our first account or where we got our student loans or got a.
Here's another version of this same problem to solve, which would be real-time consumer choice on the cell phone provider that you are using, right? Like it's still a lot of friction in changing my cell phone provider. Think about a service that would allow you the ability to, in a snap, change your cell phone provider.
Yeah. T-Mobile doesn't want to hear that from you.
No, none of them would want to hear that. That's part of why that idea got tabled. But yeah, it really would solve a customer pain point, what we call the what sucks in big bet leadership. Like that sucks. Like the changing provider, changing your bank, changing your cloud provider. Those all suck for the customer.
Right. And it's made to suck.
Yes. Yeah, there's definitely, this concept of smart friction, right? There is smart friction there.
Yeah. I just got back from 3 weeks in Europe. And when I got my cell phone bill, even after buying the additional international plan, T-Mobile, I still found it was double.
Interesting.
So I would have loved to have switched to my local carrier
Right.
in Copenhagen and in Stockholm and in Berlin for each time I switched countries. That would have been great. That would have been great. John, if people want to get in touch with you, want to get your Substack, want to get your newsletter, what's the best way for them to do that?
Find me on LinkedIn. John Rossman is the easiest way. You can find all that stuff there, get in contact with me there.
Fantastic. John, it's been an absolute pleasure. Another great innovation communicator. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Susan.
I truly hope you enjoyed today's conversation. If you did, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe so you never miss the next story that could inspire your own. And if you want to learn more about me or how I can help you and your team to become master storytellers to get your big idea to its finish line, head over to innovationstorytellers.com and schedule a call with me.